The Youth Academy Challenge is one of the most famous and most difficult challenges in all of Football Manager. The rules are pretty simple. You take a team and get them to the top without making any transfers at all. Now, in the classic version of this challenge, you're supposed to take a team that is unplayable in the base game. The idea is that you bring the club from way at the bottom all the way up to the top without signing a single player. Of course, this is extremely time-consuming and it requires a lot of patience. Plus, some of us don't necessarily want to play with the leagues that come with the base game. Anyway, I've done a little bit of experimenting. For my latest save, I've decided to manage New York FC in the World Super League database. World Super League is where 1,200 teams from all over the world are stuck together in the same league structure. Now, I've chosen a team up near the top of the pyramid, mostly because I don't want this save to last an eternity. However, I've also decided to add in all the legendary players from Fenech's recently released database. Of course, that gives most of the other clubs in the game, especially the older ones, a huge advantage, but not our club. And so I've decided to give my own club its own advantage by giving us basically a perfect youth setup. And so this is not the traditional version of the Youth Academy Challenge, but honestly the only real difference here is that I'm trying to skip all the beginning steps and just go straight for the end game. If you play the Youth Academy Challenge the correct way, you'll wind up at this stage eventually, though it might take you a couple dozen seasons. And if you're playing against all-time great players like I am, you probably will be relegated along the way. Now, the first thing we have to figure out is just which variables are the most important for generating high-quality youth players. And of course, there's a bit of disagreement on the subject. Some of this stuff is obvious, like the youth coaching, youth facilities, and youth recruitment rates. Now, if you're playing the game the right way, you want to keep asking the board to make improvements to those things over and over again until they agree. In theory, it should be easy. You should theoretically have more money to improve youth intake if you don't pay for scouting at all. In reality, of course, things can be more complicated. Now, if you want to take a shortcut, you can always go into the pregame editor and just give yourself perfect coaching facilities and recruitment. And while you're at it, you might as well improve the youth importance at your club. Remember, though, that the national youth rating is actually more important than the club youth rating. And you can increase the national rating as well, of course. But that brings up questions about whether you're actually, cheating or not. If the goal is just to get the best possible youth intake, then you absolutely should make changes to your national youth rating. And the problem is that you can't really change your national youth rating in the game, at least not to my knowledge. There are also people who have noted that things like the level of football importance and some economic factors can also impact youth intake in certain countries. It's one of those confusing things where Sports Interactive has added in a ton of variables to make it as hard as possible for us. Again, if you want to do this the right way, you probably shouldn't make widespread changes like this. It sort of depends on what the goal of your project is. And this is also a reason why most people who do the Youth Academy Challenge do it in countries like, England, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and so on. You don't see a lot of these challenges successful in places like Laos or Mongolia. Now, the thing you might forget to do is to change your club's reputation. If everything else is set high but your reputation is low, you still will not generate great quality players. They'll just wind up going to clubs with higher reputations. Actually, increasing your reputation is incredibly important. You want to make sure that your club's reputation is at least somewhere near the other clubs in the league that you're playing in. If it's too high, it will be too easy. And if it's too low, you'll find that you can't win even with the best plan and the best tactics. And your best players will choose to leave and be unemployed instead of playing for a team with such a low reputation. Anyway, do yourself a favor and increase your club's reputation while you're in the editor. Well, I tried this a little while ago. I had a youth-only save with a North Korean side in the World Super League that I stuck in there. I gave the North Korean team a really low reputation rating, and in result, I couldn't get the club to improve no matter what I did. After about 10 seasons, we were still at the bottom level and couldn't win more than maybe 6 games per season. Our best players were not good enough to play for other teams in the league, and yet they refused to play for us because our reputation was so low. In the end, I had to abandon the save because it became unplayable. Anyway, reputation really matters. The other thing you might want to do is increase your club's finances. Either that or just give yourself a sugar daddy owner and call it a day. This way, you're not in danger of losing your youth setup for financial reasons. Now, what usually happens is you'll wind up with a ton of money in your transfer budget that you never end up spending. That's not a big deal unless the board makes it a big deal. They tell you that you have to spend the money. I'm not sure what you should do when that starts to happen. There are other things you can do, like increase the chairman's patience. You can also make it so that he favors youth development at the club instead of always asking you to buy players. Anyway, changing stuff like this can make it easier or more difficult depending on what you want to do. And then comes the real key to all of this, the head of youth development. Now, this is where we see a lot of disagreement. Some people say that the head of youth development only impacts hidden attributes, or in other words, the head of youth development's ability to judge current ability and potential ability really isn't that important. But that's really confusing since the game tells you that these are important attributes. Anyway, there's a lot of disagreement on this issue. I honestly don't know what the right answer is. Somebody would need to perform an in-depth study, which is really hard to do because of the reputation issue and all the other variables. What we do know is that personality is really important. The head of youth development's personality will impact the personality of players created at the club. Now, you want players with high levels of professionalism. This is because professionalism dictates how well the player will develop. Anyway, we know about that because of the work that Evidence-Based Football Manager did a few years back. Thanks a ton, Max. Now, what you need to remember is that personality is important, but it's not everything. Or in other words, if you got a player with a poor personality, low professionalism, don't just release him. Personality can change over time just like the other ratings. You can create mentoring groups if you want, though honestly I've had mixed results doing this. However, players with high potential ability but poor personalities can also make good loan fodder. If you give yourself a super youth setup like I've done, you'll wind up with a ton of really good young players at your club, and that means that you can start making big money doing the loan game. Once you've developed things to a certain extent, my recommendation is to create a list of players at each level on a spreadsheet. You can use the squad planner if you really want, though I think it's a waste of time. Figure out 2 players at each position at each level and keep them at the club. Loan everybody else out. When players hit a certain age, maybe 23 or so, and they aren't on your first team, then just sell them. So if you're not giving yourself a sugar daddy owner, this is one trick that you can do to make sure that you've got enough money. If you then stick around for like a decade or two, you should get to the point where your club always is flush with cash and where your outgoing loans are really making you all the money that your club needs. Now, I did this setup a while back in the World Super League playing with Howland, a pretty obscure club from the Sheffield area in England. I got us up to the top in something like 7 or 8 seasons. Things were still rough in the Premier League, of course, since we were playing the best clubs in the world. However, it absolutely is possible to start dominating other teams without doing any transfers at all. And remember, the shortcuts and cheats that I did were mostly just to save time in the process. In theory, if you're patient enough, you can make this work even without changing anything in the game. Just remember, though, that you want to focus on youth facilities, junior coaching, and youth recruitment. Also, make sure that you've got a head of youth development with a high level of professionalism. When you do that, the sky really is the limit. Anyway, it's an interesting way to play the game, that's for sure. I prefer youth development to buying players because it forces me to use players that I wouldn't use otherwise. Give it a try and let me know how it goes.